You failed again this morning. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else noticed. You just did not do the thing you told yourself you were going to do. Maybe it was the workout. Maybe it was the writing. Maybe it was the hour of focused work that was supposed to happen before the distractions started arriving. Whatever it was, it did not happen. And in the space where it did not happen, something familiar appeared. The explanation you have used before. That you lack discipline. That other people have something you do not. That the version of yourself you keep planning to become requires a quality of willpower that is simply not present in your particular configuration of character and motivation. This explanation feels honest. It feels like the mature, self-aware recognition of a genuine limitation. It is not honest. It is the wrong explanation entirely, and as long as you keep using it, the thing that did not happen this morning will not happen tomorrow morning either. Because the problem is not that you lack discipline. The problem is that you have been trying to get discipline the wrong way. In a way that is working directly against how your brain actually operates. And no amount of motivation, intention, or self-reproach can compensate for a strategy that is fundamentally mismatched to the system it is trying to change. Here is what most people never fully understand about discipline. The people who appear to have it in abundance, the ones who exercise consistently, who produce regularly, who seem to move through the demanding parts of their days without the internal negotiation that exhausts everyone else, are not doing it through greater willpower. They are not fighting harder. They are fighting smarter. Specifically, they have stopped fighting their brain entirely and started working with it. This is the distinction that changes everything. And this video is about how to make it in your own life. Your brain was not designed for the world you are currently living in. This is not a metaphor or a motivational reframe. It is a neurobiological fact that has direct and practical consequences for every attempt you have ever made to become more disciplined. Over millions of years of human evolution, the brain was shaped by one overriding priority: immediate survival. Not long-term flourishing, not abstract goal achievement, not the kind of consistent, sustained, effortful behavior that modern life rewards. Immediate survival. In the environment where this brain was formed, the adaptive behaviors were specific. Conserve energy whenever possible. Seek rewards that arrive quickly. Avoid effort that does not produce immediate return. These were not character flaws. They were survival advantages. The ancestor who rested when rest was available lasted longer than the one who expended effort unnecessarily. The ancestor who pursued available food, rather than deferring gratification, was more likely to eat. The ancestor whose nervous system rewarded immediate action with immediate pleasure was more motivated to take the actions that kept them alive. This software, calibrated across millennia for an environment that no longer exists, is still running. In you, right now. When you decide you are going to wake up early and work out, your brain does not evaluate this decision against your long-term health goals. It evaluates it against the immediate cost, the warmth of the bed, the cost of the cold, the effort that would be required, and it generates a recommendation based on that evaluation. Stay. When you open your laptop intending to work on the project that matters, your brain does not evaluate this against the career you are trying to build. It evaluates the immediate landscape. Over there is the work, which requires sustained focus and offers rewards only in the distant future. Over here is the phone, which offers immediate stimulation, immediate novelty, immediate dopamine. The recommendation arrives before you have consciously decided anything. Pick up the phone. This is not weakness. This is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that the environment it was designed for no longer exists. And the environment you are actually living in, built for productivity, sustained attention, deferred gratification, and the consistent execution of behaviors whose rewards are abstract and distant, is almost perfectly mismatched to the software running beneath every decision you make. This mismatch is the actual source of your discipline problem. Not character, not willpower, not the particular weaknesses of your specific personality. A design conflict between an ancient brain and a modern world. Understanding this conflict clarifies something that most people who struggle with discipline never quite see. Willpower is not a solution to a design conflict. It is a temporary workaround that exhausts itself. When you rely on willpower to produce disciplined behavior, when you grit your teeth and push through the brain's resistance through sheer force of intention, You are winning a battle while losing the war, because willpower is a finite resource. It depletes across the course of a day of demands. Every decision, every resistance, every moment of choosing the difficult over the easy consumes from a reservoir that does not replenish on demand. And when the reservoir runs low, which it will, because it always does, the brain reverts to its defaults. The automatic behaviors, the path of least resistance, the choices that require the least energy, which are almost never the choices that move you toward the life you are trying to build. This is why discipline strategies built on motivation fail so reliably. Not because motivation is worthless, but because motivation is volatile. It fluctuates with mood, with energy levels, with the particular quality of the day. And a discipline strategy that depends on motivation being present is a strategy that will fail on every day motivation is not present. Which is most days. The people who appear effortlessly disciplined have not solved the motivation problem. They have made motivation irrelevant by designing their environment and their systems such that the desired behavior requires less effort than the undesired one, such that the brain's natural tendency toward the path of least resistance leads toward the right action rather than away from it. This is the fundamental insight that changes the discipline question entirely. You do not need to overcome your brain. You need to design around it. The concept that makes this concrete is what researchers call choice architecture. The structure of the environment that makes certain choices more or less likely, not by changing your preferences, not by increasing your willpower, but by changing what is closest, most visible, most accessible when the moment of decision arrives. The insight embedded in this concept is both simple and profound. Human behavior is shaped less by what people want than by what is easy. Not in the dramatic sense of people choosing laziness over ambition. In the specific, moment-to-moment sense that when a behavior is easy to initiate, it gets initiated far more often than when it requires even small amounts of additional friction. The barrier does not have to be large to be effective. The additional steps required to get your workout clothes from the bottom of the drawer instead of from next to the bed are not physically demanding, but they are enough. Enough to tip the balance, on the margin, toward staying in bed on the days when motivation is not strongly present. And on most days, motivation is not strongly present, which means the margin is almost every day. Remove the friction, and the behavior becomes dramatically more likely. Not because you have changed, not because your brain has been rewired, because the path of least resistance now leads in the right direction. This applies in the other direction equally. The friction that makes undesired behaviors harder to initiate is as powerful as the reduced friction that makes desired behaviors easier. The phone that is not within reach generates a different behavior pattern than the phone that is. Not because you have increased your willpower, because the automatic reach, the behavior your brain initiates before conscious decision intervenes, now reaches for nothing. And in that fraction of a second, the conscious mind has time to redirect. This is the design principle. Make the right behavior easy. Make the wrong behavior require friction. And watch as your behavior changes, not because you became a different person, but because you stopped requiring the person you already are to fight the environment you have constructed. There is a specific technique that makes this design principle actionable at the level of daily habit construction. It works by recognizing something about how the brain's existing habit loops operate. The brain executes habits through a three-part cycle: a cue that triggers the behavior, the routine behavior itself, and the reward that reinforces the loop. These cycles, once formed, operate with remarkable automaticity. The cue arrives, the behavior follows, the reward is received, the loop strengthens. This is why brushing your teeth in the morning requires essentially no decision. The cue, waking, entering the bathroom, is so thoroughly linked to the behavior that the behavior initiates before any deliberation has occurred. The insight that follows from this is elegant. You do not need to create new habit loops from scratch. You can attach new behaviors to existing ones. Using a cue that is already automatic to trigger a behavior that you want to make automatic. This is the technique sometimes called habit stacking. If you already make coffee every morning, automatically, before you are fully awake, as a deeply embedded loop, you have a reliable cue. A cue that fires every morning regardless of your motivation level, regardless of how well you slept, regardless of what is on your calendar. Attaching a 2-minute journaling practice to that cue does not require you to independently decide to journal. It requires only that the journaling happen after the coffee is made. The existing loop carries the new behavior. The automaticity that already exists in the old habit extends, through repetition, to the new one. The two behaviors couple at the neural level, and over time, the coffee cue triggers both. The power of this approach is specifically in what it bypasses: the decision. The moment of deliberation in which the brain evaluates the cost of the behavior against the available alternatives and generates the recommendation based on immediate energy conservation. By the time that moment would arrive, the behavior has already been initiated. Momentum is already in motion, and maintaining motion is neurologically easier than initiating it. The hardest part of any behavior is the start. The stacking technique eliminates the start as a decision point. The start is automatic. What follows is simply continuation. There is a dimension of this approach that most productivity frameworks address only superficially: the question of what happens on the days when nothing works, when the friction has been reduced, and the habits have been stacked, and the environment has been designed, and you still do not do the thing. Because those days exist. They will always exist, and the discipline system that works only on good days is not a discipline system. It is a motivation system with better infrastructure. The genuine solution to this requires something that goes deeper than environment design. It requires a specific relationship with the concept of identity. Not identity in the abstract sense. In the concrete, behavioral sense of the kinds of choices that accumulate over time into a picture of who you are. Every time you do the thing, even in a reduced form, even imperfectly, even for 2 minutes instead of the planned 30, you are casting a vote. Not for the outcome, for the kind of person who does that thing. Every time you exercise when you do not feel like it, you are not only exercising, you are accumulating evidence that you are someone who exercises. Every time you write when the writing feels difficult, you are not only writing. You are building the case, one data point at a time, that you are someone who writes. This accumulation is slow. It is genuinely invisible in its early stages, but it compounds. And at a certain point, after enough votes have been cast, after enough evidence has accumulated, the identity ceases to be something you are aspiring toward. It becomes something you are operating from. The discipline is no longer an effort. It is an expression of who you have, through the patient accumulation of small, consistent choices, actually become. There is a reason the approach described in the first part of this video works, when motivation-based approaches do not. And the reason is more specific than the general principle of designing around the brain rather than fighting it. It has to do with a feature of human psychology that most discipline frameworks completely ignore: the relationship between the start of a behavior and its continuation. Initiating a behavior and maintaining a behavior are neurologically distinct processes. The initiation requires a decision. It requires the expenditure of cognitive resources. It requires overcoming the inertia of the current state. The continuation, once momentum exists, requires something closer to allowing than deciding. The force that was required to begin is no longer required to continue. What this means practically is that the most important variable in whether a behavior gets executed on any given day is not the behavior itself. It is the threshold for beginning. Lower the threshold enough. Make the entry point small enough that the brain does not register it as a significant cost, and the behavior initiates. And once it initiates, continuation follows with a probability that is dramatically higher than the probability of initiation would have suggested. The person who commits to 2 minutes of writing often writes for 20, not because 2 minutes transformed into 20 through some act of will, but because the inertia of motion is easier to sustain than the inertia of stillness was to overcome. The behavior, once started, generates its own momentum. And momentum is the resource that willpower was always a poor substitute for. The 4 principles that make a behavior easy to maintain are worth examining individually, not as abstract concepts, as specific design criteria that can be applied to any behavior you are trying to make consistent. The first is visibility. The brain acts on what it can see. What is out of sight is effectively out of consideration at the moment of decision. This is not a failure of memory or attention. It is the brain doing what the brain does. processing the immediate environment, responding to what is present. The book that is open on the desk generates a different behavioral response than the book that is in the bag in the other room. Not because the person values reading differently in each scenario, because in one scenario, the cue is present and the initiation threshold is low. In the other, the cue is absent and the initiation requires an additional step that, on the margin, tips the decision toward something else. Design for visibility means deliberately placing the cues for desired behaviors in the path of natural attention. Not hiding them, not leaving them to be remembered, positioning them so that they are encountered before the moment of decision, so that the decision, when it arrives, is already primed in the right direction. The second principle is attractiveness. Not in the sense of making behaviors enjoyable through self-deception, in the specific sense of associating the behavior with something that is already attractive. The workout that happens while listening to a podcast you genuinely enjoy is not the same psychological experience as the workout in silence. The work session that begins with a ritual you find pleasantly anticipatory, a specific beverage, a particular music selection, the particular quality of light in a chosen space, carries a different emotional valence than the work session that simply begins with the demand of the work. The attractiveness does not change the fundamental nature of the behavior, but it changes the anticipatory experience. And anticipation is what moves the brain toward initiation. An attractive behavior is one the brain leans toward. A neutral or aversive behavior is one the brain leans away from. Small interventions in the attractiveness of the experience can shift which way the lean goes. The third principle is ease. This is the one most directly connected to friction reduction. The easier a behavior is to initiate, the more likely it is to be initiated. Every additional step between intention and action is a potential exit point, a place where the brain can generate the recommendation to do something else instead. Designing for ease means systematically eliminating exit points, not making the behavior easier in the sense of less demanding once engaged, making the path to engagement shorter, fewer steps, less preparation, less activation energy required, the workout clothes that are already where you will reach for them in the morning, the document that is already open on the computer when you sit down, the environment that has already been configured for the work so that arriving is sufficient to begin. The fourth principle is reward, and this is the one that most people either over-engineer or ignore entirely. The brain learns through feedback. Behaviors that produce reward signals get reinforced. Behaviors that produce nothing, or that produce discomfort without compensating reward, get extinguished. This is not a character failing. It is the fundamental mechanism of behavioral learning. The challenge with the behaviors most worth building is that their significant rewards are distant. The health benefits of exercise accumulate over years. The professional benefits of consistent writing compound over months. The cognitive benefits of regular learning arrive gradually and without clear attribution. None of these timelines are compatible with the brain's reward processing machinery, which is calibrated for immediate feedback. The design solution is to create proximate rewards, signals of completion and progress that arrive close enough to the behavior to register as feedback for that behavior. A visual tracking system that produces the satisfaction of a mark made. A brief reflection practice that allows the completion of the session to be consciously acknowledged. A small celebration, something as minor as a genuine internal acknowledgement of having done the thing, that creates a distinct emotional signal at the end of the behavior. These proximate rewards do not replace the distal ones. They supplement them with something the brain can actually use to learn that the behavior is worth repeating. There is a failure mode in habit building that these four principles help avoid, but that deserves its own direct examination. The failure of the overly ambitious start. The human tendency when beginning a new discipline practice is to begin with the version that would be appropriate after the habit is established. The person who has never exercised consistently does not begin with a 30-minute daily workout. They begin with a 30-minute daily workout, which works for 3 days, and then fails, and then the failure becomes evidence for the story about lacking discipline. When the actual problem was not discipline at all, it was the starting point. Beginning with a behavior that is sized for a fully established identity is beginning with a behavior that requires the identity to already be present. But the identity is not yet present. It is what the behavior is supposed to build. The appropriate starting point is not the version that fits the destination. It is the version that fits the current location, which is almost always dramatically smaller than what the ambition would suggest. A 2-minute meditation practice. A single paragraph of writing. One set of exercises rather than a complete workout. These beginnings feel inadequate. They feel insufficient to produce the transformation they are aimed at. And they are correct to feel this way, because they are not designed to produce the transformation directly. They are designed to produce the identity. The evidence that accumulates from small, consistent actions is not small evidence. It is the only evidence that actually changes how a person understands who they are. Every 2-minute session that happens is a data point for the identity of someone who meditates. Every single paragraph written is a data point for the identity of someone who writes. Every single set completed is a data point for the identity of someone who exercises. And the accumulation of data points, however small each individual point, eventually reaches the threshold at which the identity is no longer aspirational. It is operational. The behavior is no longer something you are trying to make happen. It is something you are. The system that this video has been describing is not complicated, but it is counterintuitive enough that most people resist its implications, because its implications include something uncomfortable. The admission that the discipline problem was never really a discipline problem, that the years of self-reproach, of feeling inadequate, of watching others appear to manage what you could not, none of that was pointing at a genuine character limitation. It was pointing at a design problem. A strategy problem, the wrong tool applied to a job that required a different tool. And accepting this reframes the question in a way that is both clarifying and demanding. Because if the problem was always design rather than character, then the solution requires design rather than motivation. It requires the patient, specific, unglamorous work of examining your environment and asking what it is making easy and what it is making difficult. It requires the honest assessment of where friction exists between intention and action and the methodical reduction of that friction. It requires the identification of existing habit loops that can carry new behaviors. It requires the creation of proximate rewards for behaviors whose significant rewards are distant. It requires the willingness to begin with versions of the behaviors that feel too small, and the patience to allow the accumulation of small, consistent actions to produce, over time, the identity that makes larger actions feel natural. None of this is as immediately satisfying as the motivational approach. The motivational approach produces a surge, a feeling of energy and intention that can sustain significant behavior for a short period. The design approach produces something less exciting and more durable, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in what feels normal, in what the default behavior is, in what the brain reaches for automatically when the moment of decision arrives. The identity that emerges from consistent small actions is not the same as the identity you started with, but it is also not the dramatic transformation that motivational language tends to describe. It is something more ordinary, a person who does certain things, regularly, without significant internal negotiation, not because the things have become enjoyable in any simple sense, not because the struggle has disappeared, but because the identity is no longer organized around the aspiration to do them. It is organized around the fact of having done them, repeatedly, consistently, across enough time that the repetition has become the default. This is the actual experience of discipline from the inside, not the heroic experience of overcoming resistance through sheer force of will, the unremarkable experience of doing things that have become normal, that have become what you do, that no longer require the mobilization of motivation because they are no longer experienced as requiring a decision. They are simply what happens next. This is what the people who appear effortlessly disciplined have actually built, not exceptional willpower. An environment and a set of habits and an identity that make the desired behavior require less effort than any alternative, that have made the path of least resistance lead toward the life they are trying to create, rather than away from it. The brain that resists discipline in the morning is not your enemy. It is a brain doing exactly what it was shaped to do, conserving energy, seeking immediate reward, recommending the path of lowest cost. The answer to that brain is not to fight it. It is to build a life in which its natural tendencies lead somewhere worth going, in which the automatic reach is toward the right thing, in which the decision has been made in advance by the design of the environment and the structure of the habit, so that in the moment when motivation is absent, which is most moments, the behavior happens anyway. This is the system that actually works. Not because it is dramatic, because it is durable. Because it does not depend on any resource that fluctuates. Because it works on the bad days, the tired days, the days when nothing feels compelling, and every reason to not start feels entirely persuasive. Because on those days, the system does not ask for motivation. It does not ask for willpower. It asks only for the small, nearly effortless act of beginning something that has been designed to be easy to begin. And from that beginning, the momentum carries what the motivation could not. This is the trick. Not a trick in any manipulative sense. A trick in the most literal sense. A way of getting the outcome you want by working with the way things actually are, rather than against it. Your brain is not the obstacle. It is the instrument. Learn to play it correctly, and the discipline that always felt like something you were trying to force becomes something that simply happens. Because you built a life in which it cannot help but happen. Leave one word in the comments that describes the habit you are going to redesign starting today. Because writing it down is already the first vote for the person you are becoming.